Everybody wants a rock and a bolt to lock their rock around. It's Segaiden episode 21.
Calling HQ, area 88.
We begin this episode with another Activision title, which I believe is the second Activision game to have been licensed for SG-1000 release. Now admittedly, Rock and Bolt is not as well known as Pitfall 2, but it's very good all the same. This one takes the form of an isometric puzzle action game, or maybe it's axonometric. I always get those two confused. I don't think it matters because, despite the 3D simulated perspective, Rock and Bolt takes place entirely on a 2D plane with no need to deal with elevation. You play as a construction worker tasked with locking down a series of moving plates by placing bolts into them. Some plates are fixed, but the ones with holes in them move back and forth between two different positions. You can only bolt a plate into position at either of the two extremes of its movements, while it's come to a stop. That sounds like a simple enough setup, but it becomes more complicated when you consider that the drifting plates also double as platforms you need to ride to reach other plates. The workings of each puzzle here amount to figuring out the ideal order in which to fasten the plates down. In the earliest stages, this doesn't factor too heavily into the action, as you can reach the detached portions of each level by riding one of several different moving plates. Eventually though, the stages grow in complexity to the point where you need to figure out an optimal route in order to complete a level in the allotted time limit. This becomes especially true once the platforms spread across multiple screens. Single screen challenges become 2-screen tests, then 3, and you may only be able to access certain remote corners of a puzzle by riding a single specific platform. In those cases, each level turns into a sort of nested puzzle challenge as you work backward from the far end of the stage and lock down moving platforms without trapping yourself or locking away access to a faraway puzzle bit. There's a great learning curve here, meaning that Rock and Bolt starts easily enough, then steadily ramps up its difficulty. It also takes an interesting approach to its penalties for failure. The only way you can die, which honestly seems way too strong a word for a low-stakes puzzler like this, is to run out of time. If that happens, you lose a life, but your progress in the current stage isn't reset. Instead, you jump right back into the level where you left off, but with only a minute on the timer instead of the usual 3. This gives you a chance to retain what you've accomplished, but it also keeps things feeling urgent. You also have a choice for how aggressively you want to pursue score bonuses. Most plates in Rock and Bolt have 2 bolt holes, but you only need to put down a single bolt in order to lock it down. If you take the time to drop the additional bolt, you'll earn extra cash, which is your score metric here, but this takes a couple of extra seconds that you may not be able to afford to spare in the more complex multi-stage screens. Notably, you're never locked into a bolt decision. If you secure a plate only to realize you fixed it in the wrong place, you can simply remove the bolt and allow the plate to begin moving freely again. Undoing a bolt deducts the appropriate amount of cash from your earnings, and it costs you a couple of seconds. The game doesn't punish you for making a poor choice. This comes in handy in the target mode stages in which you need to bolt down plates at specific locations. Rock and Bolt contains 2-stage formats which alternate between levels. Free mode is essentially as it sounds. So long as you can lock down all the moving plates in a level, you win. The second mode comes with more particular demands. You need to lock down the plates in specific locations, which you'll find in the small level display map in the lower right corner of the screen. Until all plates are fixed into the exact configuration depicted in the radar box, you can't move ahead to the next level. This mode doesn't expect you to work entirely according to the minimap, though. When you lock a plate in the wrong position, the bolts appear red rather than yellow, a clear indicator that you've messed up. The targeted mode isn't that much more difficult than free mode, though it can become pretty demanding further in once the puzzles begin to span the full 3 screens. It never feels unfair or unreasonable. Thanks to a strong premise, crisp controls, and complex puzzle scenarios that spin out from a set of simple mechanics, Rock and Bolt is the kind of game that inspires you to try again after you lose. The design has a great one more go appeal to it, making for an excellent addition to the SG-1000 library. Less impressive than Rock and Bolt is SG-1000's conversion of elevator action. I can't believe I'm saying this, but the NES version of elevator action absolutely blows this one away, and that one was programmed by Micronix. When Micronix shows you up, you know you've done something wrong. And yet here we are with what the Game Developers Research Institute posits to be the very first Tosei versus Micronix face-off in the history of NES works and its ancillary projects. And Tosei takes the L. To be fair, the deck was stacked against them in this case. The gap in hardware power between NES and SG-1000 really works in the NES's favor when it comes to elevator action, a game based entirely around vertical scrolling, something the NES could handle at the hardware level. Elevator action, of course, casts players in the role of a secret agent codenamed Otto, who infiltrates a high-rise office building by way of the roof and promptly makes his way down to the ground floor, collecting classified enemy documents along the way. Since this is a Cold War parable, rather than some spirited Edwardian spy tale, Otto navigates each building by way of elevator, or occasionally escalator. Riding elevators, as the game's title suggests, comprises the core of the action here. Otto can move freely up and down the building by way of its elevator system, which clearly was built with responsiveness in mind rather than safety. The elevators lack doors, and careless agents can plunge to their deaths into an open shaft. But the upside is that these death boxes will move instantly up or down with the press of a button. This means the screen is almost constantly scrolling up or down, which means that the SG-1000's lack of per-pixel scrolling support really makes a hash of this central mechanic. Now, scrolling games can work perfectly well in SG-1000. Even early releases like Star Luster and Monaco GP presented quite effectively. However, those games had the benefit of rapid forward motion in a single direction, something contrary to the basic nature of elevator action. Not only can vertical movement and elevator action shift direction in a split second, that movement always unfurls at a more measured pace. That's a key component of the game's design. The tension of a slow-moving elevator leaves Otto vulnerable to enemy attacks until he reaches the next floor, as he can't jump or duck while an elevator is in motion. He observes proper elevator safety etiquette, even if the Eastern Bloc architects who designed these buildings didn't. This is where the SG-1000 port falls apart. These tense rides are turned into absolute death traps by the stop-start scrolling required by the hardware. It becomes utterly frustrating to try and draw a beat on enemies when the motion involves so much stuttering and sputtering. Even more infuriating, enemy agents, whether by design or coincidence, seem to use the V-blink period when the screen redraws everything to a new position as their opportunity to unload around at Otto. This has the effect of meaning that you'll spot an enemy standing around only to find a bullet has been loosed in your direction once the screen is shuffled a tile upward or downward, leaving you with no time to react by the time it's all drawn. The choppy scrolling also has the knock-on effect of making elevators less responsive than in other versions. There's a small delay in directional changes you don't experience in other iterations of the game. In other words, this take on elevator action gives you less time to respond to enemy attacks, and your responses are slower, making for the most difficult take on elevator action I've ever encountered. Granted, harder than the real thing increasingly appears to be Sega's angle with arcade and computer conversions, but in this case, the boost in difficulty doesn't appear to be an intentional or organic revision. Simply making your way down the initial elevator shaft ride to the floors where you need to step off and make your way on foot is nearly impossible to survive without manipulating and exploiting the game's programming. Enemies tend to cluster by the elevator shaft and gun you down at point-blank range as you descend, a habit that you should be able to evade by riding the elevator to a point where you bait them to fire at you before immediately doubling back so their shot hits the elevator frame instead of you. Because of the haphazard responsiveness of the elevator controls in this version, and the screen scrolling's tendency not to depict enemy agents drawing a bead on you before firing, this becomes nearly impossible. Instead, the only real way to survive this deadly gauntlet is to cause enemies to despawn. When you scroll an enemy to the edge of the screen, the game will forget they exist and cause them to disappear, so you just need to do that until you've cleared enough of a path to make your way downward. By and large, elevator action is the same game on SG-1000 as on other systems, it's just, worse, missing details, and essentially requiring you to exploit programming flaws that work in your favor in order to survive the ones that work against you. Hardly the most appealing approach to a conversion. And finally, a game that needs no introduction here on this channel. It is inevitably Soukoban, one of the staples of 1980s Japanese console and computer gaming, as seen on Game Boy Works and Game Gear, and I'm so tired. I'm so tired of pushing boxes. To this version's credit, it is the first ever home console adaptation of Soukoban, so that's something of note. The game had previously appeared on computers, of course, and it had already seen a release for Epic's Game Pocket Computer, its first ever portable console adaptation. But it's, the same game. A guy in a warehouse pushes boxes onto designated spots. You can push, but not pull a box. It doesn't matter which box ends up where, so long as all the designated spaces are covered. This is actually a more direct adaptation of Thinking Rabbit's original PC game than the later versions which have already appeared on this channel, with simpler visuals, no music, and grating PC speaker sound effects. It also lacks the extremely basic introductory puzzles that would open later games, jumping directly into real stage layouts. From what I can tell, Soukoban came directly to SG-1000 from MSX, as was often the case. With a game this basic, however, the fine differences more or less evaporate. This version does offer a few small niceties. While you have 5 attempts to clear all 100 puzzles, you can also select any of the stages from the title screen instead of needing to slog through the early ones in order to get to the more advanced puzzles. You can also fool around in a level editor, although it has a pretty clumsy interface and disappointingly doesn't seem to allow you to save your creations to the SR-1000 cassette recorder. Soukoban was a staple of Japanese gaming devices throughout the 80s. So you could say a console game dynasty began here, I guess, if you really wanted to. Next time on Segaiden, the Championship of Champions.